Tonight on Strange Planet, we're opening the memory hole. Not the kind that forms by accident, but the kind that's engineered. The kind that swallows wars, bodies, lies, and broken nations, and leaves behind nothing but slogans. My guest is Charles Goyette, author of Empire of Lies, Fragments from the Memory Hole, a book that reads less like political commentary and more like a post-mortem on a collapsing empire. Goyette isn't an outsider throwing rocks at the system. He's a former Armed Forces radio news anchor, a recipient of the Army Commendation Medal, a New York Times best-selling author, and a veteran of the very media apparatus that once sold America its wars. He has sat inside the machine and walked away disturbed by what he saw. In Empire of Lies, Goyette argues that modern empire doesn't survive by winning wars, but by erasing them, by burying catastrophes under new crises, by turning journalism into an enforcement arm of power, and by cultivating a political and media class afflicted with what he calls combat envy, men and women who never fought wars, yet can't stop demanding them. From Iraq and Libya to Syria and Ukraine, Goyette traces a pattern too consistent to dismiss: lies laundered into consensus, failures reframed as necessity, and a public condition to forget just enough to keep the cycle alive. This isn't a left-wing critique, it's not a right-wing critique, it's an empire critique. And it asks a question most people are afraid to confront. What happens when a civilization built on lies finally runs out of memory and belief collapses? That conversation begins now. Charles, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
I'm very fine, and thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. I think you've just about said everything I have to say, so I'm really impressed by that, and I appreciate it so much.
So you argue empire demands, or depends rather, less on military victory than on collective forgetting. What's the single most catastrophic U.S. foreign policy failure that has been most successfully erased from public memory?
Oh, there are so many. I start the book off by trying to describe why truth matters, and it doesn't seem that would be an important discussion, but it is, because we have been so separated from the truth by the official organs of the government for so long. So I like to start, for example, and without delving into what is ancient history for people who weren't alive when it happened, but I like to start with the Kennedy assassination, just to suggest that 1 year after Kennedy was killed, the war in Vietnam was set underway. There was a non-event called the Tonkin Gulf incident that didn't occur, that was later totally repudiated. President Johnson at the time said, we don't know what was going on, we might have been shooting at whales, but they used it as the pretext to create the Tonkin Gulf resolution, which gave President Johnson and subsequent presidents the kind of power to conduct the Vietnam War, which went on so tragically and at such great cost for so many years. The same sort of power that was given to George W. Bush for the invasion of Iraq, the same sort of power that continuing presidents, sequential presidents, seem to believe that they still have to bomb any country at will. So the Kennedy assassination, I believe, had the American people known what we know now, only 10 months later, they would not have approved of a war resolution by the same global military empire that, in my view, took Kennedy out, because he was tapping on the brakes of the growth of the empire and tapping on the brakes of the Cold War.
So how was this accomplished? Was it, what role, let me ask it another way. How did the media participate in this, let's say, public erasure of memory?
Yeah. 87% of the American people at the time of the Kennedy assassination bought the official story of the lone gunman. They no longer do so, but they subscribed to it almost wholesale because of the work of the CIA. The CIA became concerned about dissent about the Oswald lone gunman theory, and they nurtured and cultivated something called conspiracy theorists, and they used their media assets, which were many and which are today well documented, to try to refute any conspiratorial talk about it might have been something other than just a lone gunman. There were so many things that went on. For example, the very man that Kennedy had fired because he had been lied to about the Bay of Pigs disaster, another thing that probably a rabbit hole we don't need to go down, but because he had been lied to about a calamity, the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, actually contrived to get himself, having just been fired by JFK, contrived to get himself added to the Warren Commission, where he micromanaged the commission and its findings and met, after hours with former staff members at the CIA and so on, and plotted a number of the things that ended up contriving the credibility of the Warren Commission at the expense of the American people's natural sense of questioning. So that's really when that started, and it is not an exaggeration to say the very common term conspiracy theorist was actually cultivated by the CIA itself because they were concerned about people questioning the official dogma about the assassination. So of course, I can tell you from a long media background that for a very long time, if you wanted to marginalize yourself professionally in the mass media in America, all you had to do was come out of the closet as asking questions about the Kennedy assassination. Oh, if you were, for example, a talk show host, they might stick you on an overnight show, but the guys that got the good jobs and the big visible audiences and the great paychecks did not dare cross the line and ask the forbidden questions.
But there were those in even the mainstream media during the Vietnam War, for example, who were anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. They were covering the protests. They were, asking questions. They were embedding soldiers over in Vietnam. Why did that change? When did it change?
Well, the benchmark may have been when Walter Cronkite, the dominant television news anchor, finally went over there and came back and said it was a lost cause. And LBJ said, well, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the American people. I believe that was about the time that he decided not to stand for re-election again. But, the official establishment, the hidden state, the deep state, lied to the American people, even as this was going on. To give you an example, Daniel Ellsberg, who later released the famous Vietnam papers that were published in the New York Times and so on, absconded with
Pentagon Papers, yeah.
The Pentagon Papers, thank you. He came back from a trip to Vietnam where Secretary of Defense McNamara went to assess the situation. And on the plane back from Vietnam, McNamara confessed to Ellsberg, who agreed that the situation is very critical. It's dire. We're losing. It's badly. There doesn't seem to be a way forward that is not fraught with blood and disaster and cost and failure. That was on the airplane amongst them. They landed in Hawaii, got off the plane, and the press was waiting on the tarmac. And it was on the tarmac right after they landed at the gathered press that McNamara said, things look very good. We've turned the corner. The future is bright. We see the light at the end of the tunnel and yada, yada, yada. And Ellsberg was a little bit astonished that actually that deceit was so brazen that actually contributed to his decision, he told me later, to finally release the Pentagon Papers, that he was just astonished at the extent at which the people were being lied to.
Is there a moment you can pinpoint when you personally realized the public was no longer being misinformed but deliberately managed?
Yeah, it's hard to say. There are a couple of strange little incidents that are largely forgotten. There was the war in Bosnia in which the United States claimed that it bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade by mistake, and I don't remember the exact terms of their excuse, but it was sort of like, we bought the map at Circle K and it was the wrong map, and so we bombed the Chinese embassy. Obviously, there was more going on than met the eye. But I was skeptical of almost everything the state said at the time, based on sufficient evidence that even the words and the do to come under scrutiny. But clearly, for me, the final breaking point was the war in Iraq. And virtually everything that was said from the official podiums. I'll give you one example that is incontrovertible. I mean, people don't need to go down into strange conspiracy theories about whether somebody knew, they didn't know, and so on. But here's something that just it's simply out there for everybody to see. And this was the kind of thing that bothered me profoundly. From the official podiums, from Ari Fleischer at the White House, the press secretary, from Condoleezza Rice, national security advisor, from Dick Cheney, from President Bush, there was always, after 9/11, there was always the excuse, nobody could have foreseen the evildoers, in Bush's words, nobody could have foreseen the evildoers using airplanes on our precious buildings. Well, that was balderdash. And it was so well known, and it was so widely foreseen that the thought of a terrorist attack coming from the use of hijacked airplanes was widely known. It had protections against it had been implemented at the '96 Olympics, at the conventions, the Democratic Convention. The best example, though, I think, of the whole thing is there was a G8 industrial meeting in Genoa, Italy, in July of 2001, so just weeks before the attack on the United States. You know how these confabs go. Everybody comes to some palatial resort or some formal palace or something. Everybody stays there. They meet during the day. They have great dinners, sumptuous fests, good time. At this particular one, everybody else stayed at Genoa, Italy, at the venue of the gathering, except President Bush and Condoleezza Rice. And for some strange reason, which was not strange at all, they decided they'd be better off spending the night on a United States aircraft carrier offshore. And the aircraft carrier deployed airplanes to protect them overnight because the reports were so widely heard from the intelligence agencies from Egypt, Turkey, Germany, Russia, and others that, there was a terrorist plot afoot that involved flying airplanes into United States targets. So this was widely known, but weeks after, when the event happened on 9/11, the official story from the White House was nobody had ever foreseen the use of airplanes as a weapon. That was utter, complete balderdash, and I think it was shameful in that it was such a brazen lie. But brazen lies have been sort of the standard of the deep state, in my view. The deep state willing to tell us anything. But there's one more that's not just a brazen lie, but it indicates the complete unsuitability of American politicians to be making decisions about reordering the war. And this one should be widely known, and this one is not widely known. Weeks before the U.S. invasion in March of 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was a meeting at the White House between President Bush and some Iraqi expatriates, and the expatriates came to talk to him, brief him and talk about their interests in the post-invasion scenario. And they sat in this meeting, and Bush said, explaining to him about the factions in Iraq, and Bush said, Sunnis, Shia, why, I thought all Iraqis were Muslims. This isn't internet conspiracy. I got that from a United States ambassador. So the people that run these deep state operations, they have a goal in mind, they have an objective in mind, and we are incompetent to remake the world the way that the deep state constantly wishes to do so. It reminds me of, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, that great Disney movie about Mickey Mouse, and he unleashes all these magical forces that he is utterly incapable of controlling. He has no idea what they are, and then the deluge follows. And this is what the deep state does over and over again. Nobody told you when Hillary Clinton wanted to take out Gaddafi, nobody told you that the result would be a widespread death, that slavery would return, slave markets would return to Libya. Nobody told us about that. How about this one? Nobody told us. Americans have no idea why we had to remove Bashar Assad. As far as the strong men that we support in places all over the world, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, for example, Bashar Assad was a sissy compared to the cruelty that they evince on a daily basis. So why we had to, I don't know, the Assad regime had helped us in 9/11 and in the Gulf Wars and so on. It was a little bit unexplained. But here's what happened. The Assad regime has been toppled. In the background were such calamities as the United States Army, the United States military, the Pentagon arming jihadist factions on one side to fight against jihadist factions on the other side that were armed by the Pentagon. That's
Right.
great if you're a defense manufacturer, I guess, and you can sell weapons to both sides. That's an ancient game. It goes on for a long time. But in any event, we toppled Assad, and who ends up running Syria? Is a head chopper. His name was Jolani. The United States until just months ago had a $10 million bounty on his head. He was an Al Qaeda ISIS affiliate, and as somebody said, Daniel McAdams said, they gave him $90,000. Somebody put a $90,000 Patek Philippe watch on him, and all of a sudden he's turned into some humane, liberal, humanitarian leader of the new established Syria, where the killing goes on, largely unreported now. This
Right.
is madness.
Meanwhile, Assad had been protecting religious minorities, including Christians and Jews. And there were not too many left in Damascus, but he was protecting
Yes.
Christians and other religious minorities. You mentioned
He had liberalized conditions. He had liberalized conditions for women. Women were allowed rights. I mean, he wasn't perfect, but none of our chosen leaders around the world, are perfect. But unlike his father, who was much more the Stalinist, he began liberalizing slowly, brought the internet into Syria. There were so many fronts. I mean, he was a Western educated doctor, he was ophthalmologist, I think, educated in London, and his father was like a big brother. He had his posters, and everybody had to bow down before him everywhere he went. And Bashar, anyway, started liberalizing, drive himself around town and things like that. So it wasn't perfect, but just imagine that the dear leaders of North Korea had liberalized to the extent that Assad liberalized in Syria. We'd think it was a wonderful modern-day miracle. So I'm sorry to interject that.
No, but I mean, it also, running parallel to that was Hussein in Iraq, where, again, women could drive, women held positions in I believe the Iraqi parliament. They could be hospital administrators. He had no time for radical Islamists in his country. And then they, ginned up that war in Kuwait when it was clearly evident that he'd been told by April Glasby, the U.S. ambassador, if you have a quarrel with Iraq, go ahead.
Yes.
What was it about Hussein and Assad that they were no longer of use to the United States? What happened?
Yeah, the deep state has a different vision of the Mideast, and the deep state's vision of the Mideast is probably a number of things. As far as the Iraq War specifically went, there's a strange spectrum of coalition members. I don't mean the coalition of the willing in different countries, but forces that pushed for that war in the United States. There were people, I think probably Lawrence Kudlow is unavoidable on television, thought it would be good for the stock market. There was Karl Rove that thought that the war would be good for President Bush in the midterm elections, and that Bush pulled 10 points higher if he was wearing a bomber jacket. And there were people in the Pentagon that thought it would be a good idea because it would promote more advancement and careerism, with new activities for people in the Pentagon. There were defense manufacturers, of course, that were all over funding think tanks to write papers to promote this war. There was Netanyahu, who thought it would be good for Israel and for greater Israel. So it was this huge coalition that came together in an uncanny, it was like some strange astrological alignment of all these people, and it was an unstoppable force by the time they all hooked up arms together to push this thing. It was a relentless push job, and no amount of pushback would dissuade them from their chosen war. And of course, it was the calamity that was foreseeable.
You introduced the idea of combat envy in the book. Just again, maybe I mentioned it in the introduction, but just explain what combat envy is and who are the loudest war advocates as far as you're concerned, in terms of, I don't know, and how they're compensating maybe for personal cowardice?
Well, let me take take a swing at that. That's an extremely important condition. It's a syndrome. You won't find it in any of the standard diagnostic catalogs of modern psychiatry and stuff, but it's unavoidable. You know, during the Iraq War period, CNN, no, I beg your pardon, it was Fox News had a guy on there who was on there for probably 12 years. His name was Wayne somebody, and he was brought in. He was a CIA national security veteran, and came on there as a commentator. And he was propagating the most absurd nonsense year after year after year on television. Well, it turned out he was none of the things that he had said that he was. And I think finally somebody at the CIA got tired of him, trespassing on their accomplishments, whatever they may or may not have been, and they blew the whistle on him. But let me give you some really high profile ones. Here was Brian Williams. Brian Williams was the primary anchor on NBC Nightly News. Brian Williams claimed that he had been on a helicopter mission in the Iraqi invasion, and that they'd practically taken an RPG down the tube, and they were, forced into a corkscrew landing, and it was a harrowing experience, and how close he came to defying the odds, and so on and so forth. And his story got worse with each retelling. It was more deadly. It was more harrowing each time, and this went on and on and on. And finally, the guys that were on the mission blew the whistle to Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the services. And so they told the story. Brian Williams was all made up. Oh, yes, he'd been on a helicopter trip somewhere, and yes, a subsequent helicopter visit to the same location had been attacked by some RPGs or something, but he wasn't part of it. And he had spun this thing out of whole cloth. And when he was confronted with it, he said, maybe I had a brain tumor. Seriously. And so now, we expect news people to be able to tell us the truth about things that they don't know well, because we expect that they're going to tell us the truth about things they know best. But the things that he knew best, his own behavior, the things that he had done and he had seen, he didn't mind lying to us about, to fill some sort of a hole, to enhance his credibility. And virtually that's what Roger Ailes, I think, at Fox, it wasn't on his network, but he said, well, sometimes a guy like Brian Williams, he feels a little less than other people, and so he wants, but it's not tolerable. It's not sufficient. And you would think that the networks want to protect their own reputation by somebody, that's caught like that. But Williams was given a short vacation, I guess, and then he came back and was rehabilitated and made the primary anchor of MSNBC. But even on MSNBC, when there was the so-called sarin gas attack in Syria that Seymour Hersh completely undermined as a credible story, Brian Williams was on TV saying, he was actually quoting the songwriter Leonard Cohen, who was Canadian, who said he had lyrics in a song that said, "Oh, I am guided by the beauty of our weapons." And there was Brian Williams on TV saying the same thing. And I want to give you at least one more, which was Bill O'Reilly was the mainstay of Fox News. He was the primary talk show host, the leading talk show host on Fox News. Anybody watching this now can find on YouTube, can find videos of Bill O'Reilly saying things. Well, when my men in battle, when I lead my men in battle, this is what I do. And he said, brazenly said, well, I was in combat situation in the Falklands, and this is that, and that's my experience in the Falklands when I was in. He was never in the Falklands. No, not even. He was never even in the Falklands, much less in combat. And he went on like this all the time, all of this balderdash. He went, well, I have seen, as a war correspondent, I've seen nuns shot in the head, and I don't know whether he was talking about, the terrorism stuff in Ireland or in Central America, whatever he was. But it turned out, I mean, it wasn't true. It was demonstrably untrue. And it turned out when the excuses started rolling out, well, okay, he didn't really see it, but he'd seen pictures. Well, you and I have both seen the Zapruder film. Would we come on here, come on your show and say, yes, I was a personal eyewitness to the Kennedy assassination because I saw the Zapruder film? But his lies went on and on and on. And it goes on even more often. Those are two really visible cases in the media. But, all kinds of politicians do that. Hillary Clinton talked about, I think it was in Bosnia when she was on a helicopter and they had, a screeching landing because of the threat and the terrorists were coming after them and who knows who was shooting what at them. And another one of those famous corkscrew landings on the tarmac. It was nonsense. She had Hillary Clinton, she had little Chelsea Clinton at the time on the flight with her. There were children dressed in native costumes on the tarmac waiting to welcome them when they got there. There was no such incident. There was, I think, Sheryl Crow was on that flight. I know Sinbad, the comedian, was on that. He said the only thing scary about that trip is where we were going to go for lunch. But people make up these tales of daring do to enhance their credibility or to make themselves feel and seem important. And it's okay if you run into a guy in a bar who said, well, I was a SEAL, I was a Green Beret, and he's trying to, it doesn't do any harm. But when they're elected officials, when there's Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut talking about having been in Vietnam when he wasn't, when it's Hillary Clinton, when it's these mainstays, the primary anchors on the major networks talking up wars all the time.
Let's talk about Senator Lindsey Graham. Senator Lindsey Graham wants regime change in Russia. He wants to bomb Iran. He wants. I don't think he's ever met or John Bolton. I don't know if Bolton was an active service member. I don't believe Lindsey Graham has ever. I don't think Lindsey Graham has ever held a BB gun.
I read his remarks over the weekend. I mean, he's virtually demented in his warfare lust. If I have time, if you give me a couple minutes, I want to tell you the story about John McCain because he and Lindsey Graham were close allies. Nobody knows this story about McCain, but when he decided when he decided he wanted to run for Congress, he looked for an available seat. Where's there an opening that I can win? And he moved to Arizona, where I'm from. He bought a house for cash across the street from a friend of mine and established himself really quickly. Well, it was a crowded primary. There were people that served the state well, the state house and so on were running too. It was a crowded primary, but McCain introduced himself to the state and he ran in that crowded primary. He had a leg up. He had an advantage. This is in 1982. Newspapers were very powerful instruments in that time, 40 plus years ago. And the publisher of the big two newspapers in Arizona, the Arizona Republic and the Phoenix Gazette, was a fellow by the name of Duke Tully, and he was full of swagger and full of bombast. And Duke Tully said, I tell Arizona what to think. And he didn't mind using his paper to slur his enemies and to promote his friends and so on. And it was quite shameless, and he was quite full of himself. Well, anyway, he became, in fact, the Arizona Republic, looking back on the story with a retrospective later, said, Duke Tully, the man who tells Arizona what to think, virtually became John McCain's campaign manager. Introduced him around, led editorials and articles praising him at every turn. And why wouldn't they be friends? Because after all, Duke Tully had flown, was a fighter pilot in Korea, decorated in Korea and decorated in Vietnam himself. So it was like blood brothers. They had something in common. Only it came to pass in a couple of years, somehow the news came out, despite the fact that Duke Tully was everywhere at military dinners, commemorative dinners. He'd show up in his dress whites, and I think he was a lieutenant colonel, and in his offices were photos of him and all these, wonderful, dressed up at all these military events and talked about it constantly. It came to pass that Duke Tully was lying. He had combat envy too. He had never been in the military. He'd never fought in a war. He had never flown an airplane. He was not a fighter pilot. He was not a decorated hero of the wars. He was an utter and complete phony. Brian Williams said, well, maybe I had a brain tumor. Duke Tully, when he was called out, when he was embarrassed, the man who basically got John McCain a narrow victory in a crowded primary by stumping for him day and night and trashing his opponents in the newspapers' editorials, that man checked himself into a mental hospital when he was embarrassed, resigned, and spent some time, I don't know how long, in a mental institution. But I mean, it was a shameful thing. Now, I know John McCain, I knew John McCain, and I know people at that newspaper, and I have never been able to find anybody that could possibly explain to me how is it that John McCain, who was an actual Annapolis graduate, who actually was a fighter pilot, who actually was a veteran, who actually was a prisoner of war, did not see through Duke Tully's stories. They were close. They dined together. They vacationed together in the Caribbean. The unavoidable for comment, Meghan McCain is the goddaughter of Duke Tully. And so after all these years of close personal association, McCain never noticed, never occurred to him that all of this made up stuff was nonsense. How could he not have known? And everybody that knows it is at pains to explain. Yeah, I don't know how he could have missed it. Well, I'll tell you how he missed it. It was what do you call it? They smelled each other, you know. I mean, John McCain was probably the Lindsey Graham style. He was the worst warmonger. One of the satirical websites said when the United States was defeated in a soccer championship, Senator McCain issued a statement today, said we need to attack them immediately. It's a threat to American national security. We can no longer. I mean, that's how bad it was. And he proposed invading probably a dozen countries, Russia a couple of times, and so on. So yeah, when you bring up John or Senator Lindsey and his madness, I think of John McCain, and I think of the story of combat envy that really launched McCain onto the national stage for his warmongering. It's pretty widespread syndrome, and I'm surprised it's not more widely reported on, but that's the case.
The Democrats used to be the anti-war party. The Republicans were the hawks and so forth. Then along comes Donald Trump, promising an end to all of these never-ending wars. Before we get into Trump and his incursions into Venezuela and his desires for Greenland and so forth, what do you make of that switch where suddenly the Trump party, the MAGA party, became the anti-war party, and the Democrats became the war party? How did that happen? And was that just fakery?
It's a mystery to me to this day, but it certainly happened, and it was I guess inevitable, because the money that gets spread around from donors in the military-industrial complex, or what I call the deep state of the establishment, to politicians, is happy to grease both sides of the aisle. And so we got to the point where the Democrats wouldn't dream of turning up their nose at all the money that was available from the merchants of death. And I guess it inevitably leads to what happened. I'm surprised. I shouldn't be surprised. I'm a little astonished. I'm disappointed, I guess is the word, that the MAGA supporters who wanted to make America great quit wasting our resources around the world, making enemies for the American people around the world, regime change wars that we couldn't possibly foresee the outcome of. The MAGA supporters apparently wanted to turn American resources back to making America great again. That was the slogan, after all. And yet how quickly so many of, not all of them, but how quickly so many of them shifted over the issue of Venezuela. I have a chapter in the book about Barack Obama issuing a national security letter proclaiming Venezuela 10 years ago. Venezuela was a dire national threat to American security. They couldn't have landed 2 pontoon boats on the Gold Coast. They had no military to speak of compared to ours. They were no national security threat, but the deep state has had them in their crosshairs for a long time. It's only the pretext for that targeting that's changed. So the pretext at Barack Obama's day was it was national security threat, as though it were a military threat, and they had to sanction people there and so on. And the pretext, of course, changed because the country is so broke that the military pretext has become laughable over the years. So 10 years ago, it was Barack Obama declaring a state of national emergency with regard to the threat posed by Venezuela. Then it became Trump doing so. But to return to your original question, I think it's just I think that the anti-war position of the Democrats faded probably with Barack Obama, and maybe even sooner than that. But it was the elected officials that did it because they wanted the money.
So let's talk about what happened to President Trump and an end to these never-ending wars. And instead of pouring trillions of dollars into rebuilding Iraq, spending that money in rebuilding the United States infrastructure, why did that change? How did that change?
Well, we talked about combat envy. This isn't original with me. This is widely known and written about. There are two aspects to warfare, and they are very, very different. And one aspect of warfare is the mythic story of war, and the mythic story of war is invoked by flyovers, by marching bands, by parades, by bunting. President is festooned with dozens of flags behind him when he speaks. The mythic theory of war is about our brave men and our heroes, and we're going to do this right and making the world safe for democracy again, or whatever the story is. This is all myth. And then there is the sensory experience of war, and they are two very different things. The mythic story of war is essential to driving people into war. That's why there are brass bands. That's why there are victory parades. That's why there are flyovers, because it quickens the pulse, hearts begin to beat mightily, and so on. And the faithful, and it's a collective instinct that kicks in. But the sensory reality of war is parents crying over their crumpled children's bodies, destroyed cities and homes, people starving, no resources, no water, no hospitals, ruined lives, severed limbs, the smell of blood and smoke and bombs, fear. That is the sensory reality. But you watch these people when they start to invoke wars, and they rely totally on the mythic reality of war. And this is, Rudyard Kipling, the poet of the British Empire, wrote about this once, and he kind of reversed the order. He said, I think his poem read something like, the veteran is discarded and marginalized after the war is over. And he said, it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away, but it's Mr. Atkins, sir, when the band begins to play. That's when they're wanted. That's when they're recruited. That's when they're needed. But after the war, they're all forgotten because all of a sudden the brass bands and stuff don't have the power that they had before the war. So for some reason, Trump is totally, has always been totally mesmerized by this. In his first term, it was very evident that he was infatuated with people with chests full of medals. He loved it. And the more medals the guy had, he was Trump. You don't think of Trump as being soft-spoken, but he'd defer to these guys constantly. He was very impressed by that. But he is totally absorbed in this mythic thing of war. And of course, when he comes into office the second time, what is the first thing he wants? He wants a big military parade, and he wants more flags at the White House, and he does, and he erects another huge flag at the White House, and it's all about the show and all about the mythic stuff. And he's totally mesmerized by it. And that is why, despite the fact that, the United States spends, I suppose, as much as the next probably 8 countries combined on warfare, $1 trillion a year, which maybe understates it. Just a couple of months ago, President Trump said, I'm going to call for us to increase that by 50%, $1.5 trillion a year. We don't have $1.5 trillion a year. The United States is, last year, the United States added $1 trillion to its national debt every 150 days. I mean, it's quite unsustainable. Now we're adding $1 trillion of debt every 71 days. I mean, it's absolutely insane. There's no prospect for paying any of it back, which, of course, is why the rest of the world is, starting to move away from fiat, from made-up, unbacked currencies, and forming new currency alternatives like the BRICS and stuff. They know that American debt is not repayable at these levels, and yet the levels are growing faster and faster. We're the largest debtor in the world. We'll be at $40 trillion in visible debt by probably this summer. Then there's the invisible debt, the hidden debt, the unfunded liabilities of things like Social Security. The society will collapse if those are not paid. So they can't be repudiated. People depend upon them. So the United States debt is simply unpayable except by one expedient, and that is printing more and more and more paper money of less and less purchasing power. So nevertheless, Trump is so mesmerized by the mythic aspects of war, the flags and the parades and the bunting and the flyovers and so on, that and then he's influenced by people. He's obviously influenced by the warmonger crew. Lindsey Graham now has made himself a sort of a regular. It's Lindsey Graham and Benjamin Netanyahu all the time. I see Benjamin Netanyahu is coming back for what is his sixth or seventh visit since Trump became president a year ago. So he's completely in thrall of warmongering. I think that President Trump is bored now, is not engaged in domestic issues too much. He'll speak about them a little, but he's a little dilettantish about knowing what's really going on, and it occurs to him later, and people tell him when a calamity arises about it. But his heart, the only thing that seems to excite him is bombing, and that gets his attention, and he's focused on it. And it's his, we have a national security threat by Cuba. He announced just last week that Cuba is a profound national security threat to the security of the American people. We are a fragile bunch here, aren't we?
It's been this era that we're in has been described as we're moving away from the post-Second World War sort of liberal order into sort of a multipolar war. Some call them civilizational states. We've got Russia, which of course was an empire. We've got India, which is a civilizational state. Turkey, maybe to a certain extent. Certainly China. And then you have the United States, and they all have their spheres of influence. So we have, it seems like, this impending clash of civilizations. Could you not argue that the United States has to defend itself against and its sphere of influence, which is now essentially the entire Western Hemisphere, against Russian or Chinese incursions?
You can argue that. I will say, for example, in the case of China, what keeps President Xi in China and the rest of the people in the capital city there awake at night is the fear that somehow their people will go unemployed and turn on the government. That's what they're worried about. They have got to keep these people that came from the countryside a generation ago and so on are now employed. They've got to keep them busy. So the idea that China, this is one of the great myths, that it's necessary for the United States to keep the sea lanes open. Who wants to close the sea lanes? China is utterly dependent on imports through the South China Sea and utterly dependent on exports through the South China Sea. So the idea that the United States needs to protect the sea lanes halfway around the world, in fact, if you look at what the United States really does with regard to sea lanes, it uses its naval might to enforce sanctions against countries for shipping. They're not keeping the sea lanes open. They're enforcing sanctions to keep sea lanes closed for people like Iran and Russia and others. It's fraught with peril. But I'm glad you brought that up, because this is one of the great myths of the imperial state, the American military empire, say its defenders, they do this, they do that, and the other things, and that's one of them that's always high on the list, that America needs to keep the sea lanes open. But we have ample evidence that the cost of alternatives to the sea lanes, if they're blocked by an opponent or a rival, the cost of alternatives is nothing compared to the cost of warfare. And we have examples of that. I mean, we have the so-called Arab oil embargo in the 1970s. Well, actually, during that period, the United States actually imported more oil. And Americans think, oh, there were gas lines and so on, so we must not have had enough. That wasn't the case. We imported more oil than before the Arab oil embargo. The gas lines were because of Nixon's kind of crazy wage and price controls and price fixing. Gasoline stations had already started closing before the Arab oil embargo because of price interference, price interventions by the Nixon administration. But even a better example is the closure of the Suez Canal for, and I've forgotten, I think it was about 8 years. And the countries that were highly dependent on traffic through the Suez Canal, like Great Britain and France and stuff, had to take the long way around, had to go around the Cape. Their shipping was more costly, shipping was slower. And I detail in the book, based on academic research, not my own, but by others, what was the cost to the GDP of France or Great Britain of this additional cost and time and expense of shipping having been denied access through the closed Suez Canal. And it is astonishing. It is very, very small. And of course, the cost of warfare is very, very big and in fact unknown, because we don't know where the warfare will end up going. So the cost of warfare just on its face is, and of course, then you still have to use the alternative sea routes anyway during the period of the warfare. So you're stuck with the alternative sea routes and the additional cost of warfare. And I describe that pretty carefully in the book, Empire of Lies, Fragments from the Memory Hole. And it's not because I'm trying to detail all the history of empire. All these things about empire are very important for people to understand, because they need to understand that the truth matters. And in this country, we've begun to devalue the truth because we're so used to being lied to by officialdom that goes in one year, everybody kind of shrugs, oh yeah, this is what they say, and so on. And nobody, when I was a kid, everybody believed what government officials said. Now almost nobody believes anything anybody says about anything. And it says post-COVID and post-wars in which there were no WMDs available and so on. And yet, we tolerate the misinformation and the lies that come out of the deep state and come out of the establishment, even so. But it matters. It matters because if you knew, for example, the real story behind what I suspect is the real story, and I'm not trying to get anybody to subscribe to this belief, if you were to investigate, for example, TWA Flight 800, which was shot down leaving New York on its way to Paris, and the eyewitnesses whose stories were changed by the FBI, who were not allowed to testify before the official investigation. But if you examine all the eyewitnesses that claimed they saw something streaking up from the horizon, from the ocean to that plane, and then the plane somehow climbing 3,000 feet after it struck, the idea that it was a phantom spark in the center fuel tank that had never occurred before in 1 million 747 takeoffs and landings over the prior decades. If you begin to question episodes like that, then you begin to question the subsequent events. And if the American people thought, just as a hypothesis, and I don't care if anybody believes it or not, but I lay the evidence out, if you thought that the flight TWA was taken down by a terrorist event, by some sort of foreign intervention, then all of a sudden things would have been very different in the way that we handled the security of our flights all the way up until 9/11. Just a kind of a simple sort of a secular example, when mad cow disease developed, McDonald's started spending a lot of money, because if their beef wasn't safe, their business was over. And spinach growers, when E. coli appeared in in Modesto or someplace in California, they spent tons to protect their reputation and to use new procedures, new affirmative steps to take care of it rather than lose their entire market share. And the airlines clearly would have done the same, and things might have been very, very different. So it's very important for people to revalue the truth and to begin to look at things skeptically and ask the questions that the lapdog press does not ask of the media.
One journalist who did question TWA 800 was Pierre Salinger, who was John F. Kennedy's press secretary and later was an ABC news correspondent, I believe. He was stationed in Paris. And he spoke out about it, and he was basically canceled. We never heard from him again.
He disappeared down the memory hole, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's you bring up his assignment in Paris. In the serial regime changes of the United States, from the CIA all the way from Iran in 1954 to Guatemala, the CIA played a part in trying to topple de Gaulle as well. In 1960, I'm going to tell you, it was 61 or 2 in France. And there was a whole floor of the U.S. Embassy the ambassador couldn't go to on the top floor. And it was only later we discovered there were hundreds of CIA officials operating there. And during the night of the famous general's coup in France that tried to topple de Gaulle, the lights were burning, late at night. And Kennedy was embarrassed that he didn't have control of his own intelligence agencies. And he apologized to de Gaulle, and de Gaulle got the idea. And he basically said, we are not in control of our own intelligence apparatus in this country. It's a very shameful thing.
Empires in decline often escalate militarily as their influence fades. Are we already past the point where war is no longer a choice but a reflex?
Yes. We are so far past it. It is inevitable that the syndrome is called imperial overstretch. And countries, they see their relative decline. They see their loss of global hegemony or hegemony within the sphere of their empire. They see, their allies turning away from them. And it is, the imperial strength comes from economic might. That's what it is born of to begin with. America's imperial strength was born of its fabulous economic might that began to get squandered all over the world on these military, on a global military presence and hundreds of foreign bases and so on and so forth. But yes, it is inevitable because the imperialists themselves, they read their decline as a military matter. They don't realize that it is, the American dollar, no matter what you think of it, it doesn't buy what it used to buy. And America's debt is unpayable at these levels. And America is in economic decline. And I go through in the book, the decline of our share of global manufacturing and so on. But, manufacturing isn't everything, but debt is, because debt doesn't go away. I mean, your manufacturing can increase or subside, or you can change your manufacturing, whatever it may be. But the debt is very real, and it has to be paid. And it will be paid if it's not paid by the debtor, like the government. It will be paid by the creditors who will be stuck holding the bag. But one way or the other, that account is balanced. So debt is very real. And debt tells the story of America. China, only several years ago, was a creditor to the United States. When they buy government bonds, they're effectively lending money to the United States government. The government says, you lend us this money and we'll pay you back at this rate over 10 years or 20 years or whatever the term of the bond is. China held, I think, probably $1.4 trillion of U.S. government debt. Now they're down to half that in just a few years. So they're de-dollarizing their economy. Russia's totally de-dollarized. Others are de-dollarizing. So here we are, the biggest debtor in the world, with the need to borrow more and more and more, and we have fewer people interested in buying. That means higher interest rates. But at the same time, the leaders of the deep state and the establishment view this economic decline as requiring a military response, because that's all they know. They understand command economies, military economies. They don't understand that the command economy doesn't create the wealth. So, all they know how to do is to expand the empire, to beef up. That's why Trump wants $1.5 trillion $1.5 trillion military budget suddenly overnight, because of the dire threat posed to the United States by Cuba. So we already have debt that can't be paid, and now they want to increase it more and more and more. They want, intervention in more countries. They want to, they want to take Greenland. They say one way or the other, we'll take it. They, Venezuela is now a protectorate. Cuba's a national threat, and we do this. We're beefing up virtually all over the world, and now we're on the verge of another attack on Iran. That's funny. I thought last June we had destroyed their nuclear capability entirely, and now we're about to go in and destroy it entirely once again. It's crazy, but that's the fate of empires. It's a common fate.
Right, right. And you describe the United States being in the later stages of collapse. Is there any going back? Can the United States go back to a republic, or is this basically the death rattle?
Well, I think it's a little of both, and I don't want people to think that there's no hope for the United States, but there is no hope for the empire. Mark Twain said you can't have an empire abroad and a free republic at home. They're incompatible. And we know from our experience that this is true. You get things like the Patriot Act, you get the militarization of local police forces and stuff with excess military equipment, because, the military game is you always got to buy more and more, newer. What do you do with the old? Well, you either give it to terrorist states or would-be terrorist states, or to Jolani to run Syria with, or you leave it behind in Afghanistan, or you give it to local police forces to militarize domestic policing. So the two things are incompatible: a free and prosperous republic and a global military. So if the American people were to decide that they wanted to come home, if they were to decide that they wanted to get a handle on our runaway spending, if they were to decide that, and there's no evidence that they've decided that, but if they were to decide that, in time we could begin to reestablish a good deal of our prosperity and do something about this horrendous debt, probably. But there is no discernible movement to unwind the empire. And I thought maybe there was some hope of it with the MAGA movement. Then when you heard, Trump, to his credit, he came down the stairs when he ran first time for office, and he said, they lied us into the war in Iraq. Oh, everybody, you can't say that. But it was like the little boy calling out the naked emperor. No, you couldn't have said. I know personally from my own career in broadcasting, you weren't allowed to say that in 2003. You weren't allowed to say that they lied us into war for many years after, but he finally broke the spell. And so if the American people and the MAGA people had been more philosophically consistent, had not responded so willingly to combat envy, had not been so easily dissuaded by flyovers and by festooned flags and, talk of warfare, and I will take it by God. If you watch what Trump says, this is like little boys playing video games at night. It's there will be hell to pay. You'll see bombing like you've never seen bombing before. And the American people, hey, yeah, this is our country. We're together in this. And so as I mentioned, I was astounded when the Venezuela thing came up. All the MAGA people that were against regime change and wanted to put the focus back on restoring American freedom and prosperity suddenly started to, by God, they'll do what we say in our empire. And, we can shoot skiffs and boats and stuff in international waters because we can. And this is when we lost, in my term, Americans have lost the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is the old Chinese thing. If the emperor does right, and the royalty does right, and the people are prosperous, and they don't waste the people's lives in war and stuff, then they have the mandate of heaven, which you don't have to have a spiritual view of it. You don't have to say this is the divine intervention of heaven or God. But if the American people do the things that make a country free and prosperous, then they prosper. But if they do the things that make an empire overreach, overstretch, and collapse, then they've lost the mandate of heaven, because America won't be a free and prosperous empire going forward. It will be a collapsed global military empire, and that's the path that we're on. I don't see any hope of things changing, and so it sounds grim, and it is grim, but, maybe we go through a dark period and, people begin to revalue what we have done, and we become more concerned about our own lives and making our own country free and prosperous again. I certainly hope so.
Empire of Lies, Fragments from the Memory Hole. How do we get a copy, Charles?
You can get a copy at Amazon, and thank you for asking, at Amazon.com. That's actually the only place it's available now. It's Fragments from the Memory Hole, which, as you know, is the story of rewriting history in 1984 by George Orwell. And the memory hole is, in 1984, in that world, the Ministry of Love was where people went to be imprisoned and tortured. And the Ministry of Truth is where they rewrote history. So the protagonist in that story's job was to rewrite history. And when, there's an old expression from it, Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. So when, alliances change and stuff, his job was to rewrite history, and they incinerate old copies of the record the way it used to be. So it's a story about, valuing truth, and where we are headed if we don't, and where we can go if we do begin to put a premium on truth from our officials.
Charles Goyette, thank you so much.
I enjoyed it so very much. Thank you.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.